Hey, Rick,
Hey, Megan. Hey there. Happy Tuesday.
I'm surprised you have a smile on your face at the beginning of this because a minute and a half ago you were in a very cranky mood. So tell us what's happening that you're so irritated.
Well, look, I watch this market, as you well know, like a crazy person, and I watch the data that gets released, and it seems like this last several months, the data that gets released impacts the market in ways that should not impact the market. And
Mm.
so what I mean by that, if we look at like job reports, consumer sales, retail sales, consumer confidence, that kind of stuff, personal consumption reports. Those reports have been actually fairly benign the last few weeks. I mean,
Mm.
yeah, off a little bit, but not by much.
Mm-hmm.
But even the slightest bit of a missed expectation, the market sells off, and no one understands why.
Mm-hmm.
And so, when a market sells off like that, what that means is that rates are going higher,
Mm-hmm.
and we want rates to go lower. So that's
Mm-hmm.
kind of puts me into a bad mood, you know.
Yeah,
But look,
I know we were talking about we had a buyer locked in on a loan a month ago at 6.125, and
mhm.
today that rate is in the mid sevens, right? So we had to cancel that
Well,
escrow. Now we're
yeah. I mean, most loans right now, depending upon the loan, are in the sevens. They were in
mm,
the sixes, 10 days ago. Look,
mhm,
but here's the thing. I've been at this a long time, as you know. Look, nothing moves in a straight line.
mhm.
It just
Right.
doesn't. And so, yes, the last 2 weeks have been kind of ugly. That does not mean
Mhm,
it's going to go that way forever. At some point, it's gonna come back the other way, and that's why we watch this market and time it so that we lock the rate at the right time.
mhm,
So it's really a game every day of watching this market, watching the indicators, looking at what the future looks like, and then deciding if we should lock or float.
mhm, mhm.
That's what it's about.
Well,
Yeah.
the market is uh very strange, and the bottom line is that if you need to buy a house, then you still buy a house. But again,
Right.
as we always say, you just find one that suits your budget.
Right. It all works out at the end. And by the way, at some point, I don't want to give a prediction on this, but at some point, the mortgage rates will go down.
Right.
And that's going to be an opportunity to refinance to a much better payment and lower rate at some point. But the important thing is getting the house now. No doubt about it.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so that was off topic. Our topic actually is
Mhm.
today, we're going to talk about appraisals, and we're going to talk about a couple of things. I have notes here, so excuse me, going to look at those. That what is an appraisal? Who is it for? What does an appraiser do when they're at your house? What they don't do, and when does it have to be done? What's an appraisal contingency, and what happens if it doesn't appraise for what you agreed to pay for it?
Mhm.
So let's start off with, maybe we can kind of take turns back and forth. So, Rick, what is an appraisal?
It's a big topic for sure. We spend a lot of time on just that topic alone. But let me just say this about appraisals, because I think a lot of home buyers misunderstand what that appraisal does, right? And so an appraisal is not just an appraiser's opinion based on what he thinks it's worth. It's just not, it's much deeper than that. So you have to know that appraisers like you and I, they are also licensed. And so they are required to follow certain guidelines on all appraisals. Every appraiser has to follow the same guidelines. And so when they do an appraisal, they do a lot of detailed work. They look at all the comps, they do a lot of measuring, they do a lot of information. So an appraisal basically is a 13 or 14 page document when it's all said and done. And so when the appraiser looks at all the data, they will base that value based on what they're allowed to do based on that data.
Mhm.
That makes sense? So that's
It
the way
does.
the appraisal works.
And I think it's actually, I don't know about your industry, but I know
Mhm.
about mine. But I know that getting an appraisal license is like really, really difficult, that they
It
have
is.
to
It takes years.
apprentice for years. Oh yeah, it's a
Mhm.
huge deal. So good for them.
Mhm.
All right. So thank you for explaining that. And what I always tell my clients, whether, whomever likes it or not, that the appraisal is really for the bank because they're making this loan on a house, and their appraiser is their eyes and ears, that their boots on the ground, so they can make sure that the house is not in deplorable condition or there's no adverse effects that they're not aware of that would hurt their ability to liquidate this house in the future, if they have to take it back from you.
Yeah, good point, because as far as that lender knows, that house on the inside could be gutted. Might look great on the outside, but maybe the inside is totally gutted. You wouldn't know that.
That's right.
You
They
know,
want to make
so-
sure there's a kitchen and a bathroom and things like
That
that.
all works. Yeah.
So when is an appraisal typically done when you have a house with an accepted offer?
We ordered that appraisal like day 1, day 2 of that offer acceptance. That's something we want to get done right away. And I tend to kind of push that a little bit. I want to get those appraisals back within the first 5 or 7 days or sooner of the offer acceptance, because that determines a lot in terms of the structure of the loan and how we're going to proceed.
And that's pretty quick, 5 to 7 days, because you have to call an appraisal management company, and then they send that appraisal out to your approved appraisers, and then somebody has to be available to do that. So there's a middleman. That's the appraisal management company. That's been that way ever since the mortgage market meltdown of 2008 through 13. Yeah. And so so appraisers are licensed. They've been apprenticing. They have a very hard job. They're the eyes and ears of the bank, the boots on the ground. They come in and they come into the house a few days after escrow has been opened so they can get their report, because it's usually they return their report within like 72 business hours, right? 3 days.
Once they do the inspection, typically a day or 2 after the inspection, will return their report. Correct.
And so what the appraisers do when they come to sellers' homes, and even, by the way, if you don't have an appraisal contingency, there's usually still going to be an appraisal. It's not the same exact thing. But so the appraiser is going to come to the house. They're going to be there, depending on the size of the house. Probably the average appraisal is 30 to 40 minutes. They measure every room. They take pictures of everything. And they measure the outside of the house, that sort of thing. So if you're a home seller and you're getting ready to have an appraiser over, you should still clean your house, have it look nice, because the appraiser is a human being. You know, they might be working with data and that sort of thing, but you know, you're still dating your buyer at this point in the game. There's no ring on the finger of the buyer, and you really need to do everything in your control to have a nice transaction. And one of those things is to make every room in the house accessible for when the appraiser comes over. Make sure there's a smoke detector in every bedroom, one in the hallway, a carbon monoxide detector on each level, follow the instructions on the install, and that the water heater is strapped. If they see stains in the ceiling and this sort of thing, peeling paint, they're probably going to ask some questions. So just do the best that you can to prepare the house for the appraisal. Do you have any other comments?
Yeah, good point. The important thing is, and that's the important point, you're talking about the compliance pieces. In other words, the smoke detectors, carbon monoxide, and the hot water heater strapped. If the appraiser goes out there and those are not completed or done, it requires a re-inspection by the appraiser to go back out and verify if those have been installed, and then takes new photos and then sends an updated appraisal report back in. The appraiser will charge about $150 to do that extra.
Oh yeah.
And it takes more time. It will hold up an escrow if we're still missing those compliance items. So it's critical that those are installed at the time of the initial appraisal inspection.
The very sad day when you have an appraisal and you have one of those things not on there. So like, we carry extra in our car because we don't want anybody to get charged $175. Okay.
Point.
So secure your dogs, make sure your house is clean, put your cats away, open all the doors. And the appraiser's usually, in a hurry, because they do maybe 2, 3, 4 appraisals a day. I'm not sure how many. So they don't want to do a lot of chit chat. So just have them come in, offer them a bottle of water, let them look around and see if they have any questions. They're going to ask you when you did certain upgrades, and your realtor will typically have sent them a list ahead of time. So it's like anything over 10 years, the appraiser is probably not going to be very interested in as far as upgrades go. But, if you just did your kitchen, if you have the approximate cost and that sort of thing, new windows, doors, flooring, paint, electrical, plumbing, you can definitely make a list for the appraiser, what you did and the approximate year. And they always appreciate that.
Yeah, it makes their job easier because they can, they're allowed to make adjustments to value based on upgrades. So if they're aware of those upgrades and how recently they were done, they can actually give your home sometimes a higher value than the comparable properties based on those upgrades.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you did something, brag about it, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And the buyer usually pays for the appraisal. And Rick, do you know how much on average appraisals are running right now?
On average, around $600, $600 to $700.
The deal for all that work. So $600 to $700,
yeah, a lot of work.
Buyer pays for. And I'm here to tell you, as the seller, you don't get a copy of the appraisal unless there's something wrong that the buyer needs to ask you to fix something or what have you. You don't, as a seller, you don't get a copy of the appraisal. Okay.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Well, the appraisal, just so people know, the appraisal technically is the property of the lender.
Right.
The lender owns that appraisal. And so, but we are, however, required to give a copy of that appraisal to the home buyer. And we do. So at that point, if a buyer wants to release a copy of that appraisal to someone else, that's their choice. But a lender is not allowed to release it to any other third parties.
Makes sense, even though the buyer paid for it. But anyway, so that is pretty much, and then the last point of this we wanted to talk about is what happens if you agree to pay $1 million for a house and the appraisal comes at $950. So you have a $50,000 difference in what the appraised value and your purchase price are. So
that's a great question. There's a lot of, go ahead.
Well, I mean, depending on a lot of people's structure for their financing, if they have a big down payment, then it probably won't affect anything.
Correct. Even smaller down payments. So the way you typically would address that is you restructure the loan and you change the loan to value. So obviously a much bigger down payment has zero impact to the structure of the loan, none whatsoever. In some cases, we would structure it where there's maybe some PMI expense involved, but the PMI expense is minimal. It's not that big of a deal anymore. PMI companies have really reduced their premiums. So if we get into that scenario and we have to go to the higher loan to value, the difference in payment to the buyer is not really a big impact. Right. So they're fairly easy to structure most of the time.
Yeah. So you could restructure your loan. You can, if you have an appraisal contingency and you haven't waived it, you might be able to negotiate something with the seller. But if the seller had multiple offers on this property, they're probably not going to be very negotiable, but you can ask.
Yeah, for sure.
Maybe you split the amount or something like that, come up with something creative. I don't really see too many appraisal issues nowadays.
No, I haven't really had any in quite. I haven't had an appraisal issue, and I can't tell you how long. They seem to work out pretty well.
Yeah, exactly. Well, good. Well, I think that's a lot of information today. So, if anybody has any questions about appraisals, you can certainly send in your question.
Sounds good to me. We can do it.
Thank you, Rick. And I heard you got something in your kitchen after 2 years.
Yeah, the countertops came in yesterday and they look good. And it's still a work in progress here, but it's nice to see cabinets and countertops in.
Yeah, no kidding. It must be nice. I mean, have you been eating out for 2 years?
Pretty much. Yeah, I've been like camping in my house kind of thing,
Oh, terrible. Yeah, that's a pretty extensive remodel. So, oh boy,
yeah,
2 years.
It'll get done, but it's still need flooring and appliances and some paint,
Right, exactly. Oh my gosh. All right, Rick. Well, I appreciate you and we will be in touch
Appreciate you,
next week.
Megan. Awesome. Thanks. See you later.
Bye.